So I just thought I'd join in with the woos there for no apparent reason. Hi, I'm Sarah J, Virtual Sarah J, and I'm here to talk about a problem I have insofar as I love virtual reality, like probably a lot of you. And I really love VR because of the power that it takes you to other places, to understand what it's like to walk in someone else's shoes. But the problem I have is that I work with film. And I work with 360-degree film. And there's so many people that will say that this isn't true VR. And you'll hear that a lot. But that bothers me because I really, really love VR. But in 360 film, there's no interactivity and agency. But I do believe in the power of virtual reality to transform storytelling. So what I needed to do was try and find a way that I could add interactivity and agency so we could make the most of the powerful technology. So that's what I'm talking about today. Multi-sensory experience, is it the future? For me, story is king. My background was in television journalism. I spent 10 years as a correspondent. So for me, stories are the most powerful things. And I go back to this quote time and time again about the way that we have the potential to brain hack, the way that we have the potential to change how we think about things in the world. So story is king. And the power of the story is to allow us to transform when we've got the right platform to do it. Now, I have three core beliefs, three things that I come back to. First of all, everyone has a story, and stories are best experienced. We all think about those moments where we go back to that experience and we share that story. Virtual reality is ace. As I said, I love VR, and it gives us the power to share experiences. And you'll hear a lot of people talk about virtual reality as being quite an isolated experience, and I don't agree with that. I believe it's a powerful medium to share those experiences. But then thirdly, new technology needs new ways of telling stories. This isn't the same platform that we've been using time and time again. We can learn from history, but we also need to discover new ways of telling stories. Now, I work as a virtual reality content creator. I make films. I make films for exhibitions and festivals, but I also work in a university. So I get to interrogate all of those for research and actually try and find things that are working. And a lot of the time we're making all of this stuff, but we're not actually understanding what works and what doesn't work. So I do the academic research to back it all up. And I base a lot of my research on two lines of thought. The first one, which is the standard definition of presence. We hear presence talked about time and time again. The question isn't whether the created world is as real as the physical world, but whether the created world is real enough for you to suspend your disbelief for a period of time. So that's a standard definition of presence. That's what we're trying to get to. But in 360-degree film, it's really hard to get there. And then I go on to total art. And Ryan wrote the second edition of the book, Narrative as Virtual Reality, in 2015, where she describes virtual reality as being a total art form. And that's really interesting for me. It goes back to how important this technology is and the power of it if it's a total art. And for total art, we need interactivity, we need immersion, we need narrativity. So if we take both of those elements, can we achieve a deeply enhanced experience using the technology? But that brings us back to the question that I lie awake every night thinking about. How can we achieve presence and total art if we're solely dealing with film, where there's no interactivity and agency? So this is the question I think about time and time again. And it brings me back to this. So I don't know if any of you were in the talks before lunch, but we heard about Heilig Sensorama. And this is fascinating to me. I love this. I think this is absolutely brilliant. For sale for $1.5 million. I did actually contact them recently and asked if it was still for sale and how much it would be. And I had a response, but clearly I couldn't afford the actual Sensorama. People laughed at Heilig. They laughed as he conceived this idea of the cinema of the future, a cinema that reached us on many levels, the same levels as how we perceive the world. If we're using film to create a true experience, we need to think of it as that totality, and one that reaches us on every sensory level. In Heilig's vision, the cinematic experience would not just be audio and visual, but it would include taste, touch, and smell. And he wanted the senses in the experience to dominate as they would in the real world, where visual is 70%, audio 20%, smell 5%, touch 4%, and taste 1%. There's some disputing this. This is Halig's vision in 55. I would personally say the audio should be a lot higher than that, and I bet a lot of people would agree. It's interesting when you see how many companies there are here talking about haptics and touch, when that's only 4% in these stats, and smell 5%. So that's really interesting, and a lot of people laughed at Halig. A lot of people thought it was ridiculous, and still people laugh at me and my smelly films. On April the 1st, I don't know if you saw Google's tweet, Google VR, and they did their April Fool's joke around multisensory VR and smelly vision, which wasn't so good for me when I was talking that day about that subject. But we can just ignore that and say it's not really a joke. So I went to Hong Kong. And I went to Hong Kong and I made this film. And I made this film about the Chungking mansions. I don't know if anyone's watched Chungking Express, but it takes you into this location. Sorry, it's gone on to this slide too soon. This is my smelly vision, which is interesting, to say the least. So what we did, we made this film about Chungking mansions and we thought it was really good. And then we watched it and it felt really empty. It felt like a really empty film because there was no interactivity and agency, but it also lacked the full sensory experience of us being there. We missed the heat, the intense heat as you walk through the building. We missed the smells as you walk through the marketplace and you could see all of this different food and you could smell the food. For those of you who've been in markets abroad like this, you'll know that really intense smell that you get that hits you with the heat as you're walking around. So it lacked all of that. So we decided what we would do is try and replicate that experience and came up with our tent, which it won't show you. There you go. There you go. So this was literally set up as a camping tent with a heater inside it. It had gone off milk, it had sheets that had been stuck in a sewer, it had Chinese spices, and it was this combination of the smells that showed us, that captured the essence of being in that environment. It was an interesting experience, to say the least. We showed it down at the Royal Television Society amongst Sky and the BBC and all these people with very, very high-end devices and high-tech setups. And we came up with our camping tent with our milk. But we still had a queue of people all wanting to find out what it was like to have a multi-sensory experience. And the results were really interesting. We had people say that straight away they could smell the different smells and the heat that was coming off the environment, and it made it feel more realistic. It made it feel like they were there, and that's what we're trying to get. When we're trying to seek presence, that's what we're trying to get. The heat once got almost a bit too hot, but that's what would happen in the situation. It added to the experience massively. One person said that they had to take off their coat because they were finding it so hot, but that's what they would do in the environment. So we thought that's a good measure that we are actually achieving presence. When you're walking through the streets, there's all the different parts of the market. You can imagine you're there and someone is sat in a cafe next to you and you can smell what they're eating. It's really disorientating if you're seeing food in a virtual environment and you can't smell it, because naturally you should be smelling the food. And that's what we were trying to build. Generally, the heat makes you feel more uncomfortable, so it adds to the element of people coming closer to you. Your mind tricks you into thinking it's the heat coming off him. And I'll show you the quote, the picture that reflects that afterwards. And then this was really interesting. When we think about motion sickness and how motion sickness people feel in virtual reality sometimes. And this guy really felt sick when he watched it. But then when he watched it again, because we did 2 data tests, when he watched it again with the smells, he didn't feel the same motion sickness. So I thought that was a really interesting point. I'm going to skip through, actually. Yeah, so this is just some of the reactions we had.
It was really hot. I felt like I was actually in those rooms. The smells were crazy. It made it really nice, actually. And when you spritzed me with the Febreze, I actually felt like I wanted to wave at the woman. I felt like she was right there with me.
And at one particular point, a guy was literally behind me and really sort of startled me, and he kind of came from nowhere.
Smells really added. You can even do more. You can make it like disgusting in some of the rooms you were in and stuff.
I was like putting my foot out to make sure there was, the floor was there.
Well, I can see why you've got a chair. It's a good job you have. Otherwise, I'd have fallen over, I think.
Smell was kind of really added to the experience.
Okay, so what we learned from all of these tests was that the smells and the heat really enhance that experience. And when we're thinking about creating that full totality of the experience, we need to be dealing with every sensory level. I want to end by just talking about narrative. And VR and narrative is rapidly becoming one of the most talked about areas at these kinds of events, probably more so than empathy, which I think was last year's buzzword. So now we're on to narrative. In VR, I like to follow the rules set by Randall Walser in 1991, who says that we all need to become magicians. I quite like the idea of becoming a magician. And this means just throwing out all control and putting all trust in the audience. We call our audience the experiencers. It relies on narrative that's purely rooted in experience, setting up a world for the experiencer to directly navigate themselves, to just imagine it. Walser says that the space maker, his magician, can never hope to communicate a particular reality, only set up certain opportunities for different kinds of realities to emerge. For traditional filmmakers with backgrounds like myself, that's really hard. We're all pretty much control freaks. We don't want to put the faith in the audience to explore an environment themselves, but this is our opportunity to do that. It goes back to discovering new ways of telling stories within this medium. Traditional filmmakers say, look, I'll show you this environment. The space maker is saying, I'll help you discover. By understanding narratives in that way, it helps us to define a new form of film, a film that's immersive and experiential. We're just magicians and space makers creating an experience, and the narratives that are drawn from that will all be different. We all experience the world in different ways. We all take experiences in different ways. And so when we're creating a virtual reality, we need to let the audience take their own experience from that. So what I say is it's time to become the virtual playmaker. I always have to end with my kids, just because I think they look cute. Become the virtual playmaker. And looking at films in that way means that we can really create immersive experiential films that have lasting impact. Thank you. Okay. Yeah, okay.
Thank you for that talk. Just a question about the comment you made earlier about the multi-sensory experience actually reducing motion sickness. Was that just anecdotal, or do you have actual?
No, that's a subject of a bigger research study that needs to be done that I haven't done. That just came out in our data collection. So when we did the film, each time we showed the film, then we did have a series of questions after them, and then we did one-to-one interviews, and that came out from the interviews. So it's definitely something to look at.
Okay, but did you have a condition where they did not experience multi-sensory?
Yes.
To compare it to?
Yeah, so they all watched it without any added senses, and then they watched it again 2 weeks later with the sensory
Did you
experience.
counterbalance that?
Hmm?
Did you counterbalance that?
No.
presentation?
No, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. But I thought it was really interesting how maybe the mind trickery stops you feeling nauseous if you've got different senses, and there needs to be a study on it, which I haven't done.
We can have one more question.
Thanks very much, Sarah. with every conference, there's inevitably a question about whether 360 video is or is not VR, and where 360-degree video is going. What's the next step for telling documentaries with genuine video capture that would allow for the kind of interaction that we're becoming familiar with VR?
I think it's always really interesting. And I'm not sure where I stand with it. And there's more technologies coming now that allow interactivity within film. There's various softwares that allow it. I play a lot with Wonder, which is an interactive video software by the company that did Clint. For me, it kind of breaks the immersion. So I like to think about how you can get almost fake interactivity. And that's why I like having characters talking directly to you, to the camera, so it feels like you're connected and you're not, but it makes you feel like that. And I think that's a really powerful tool, and we've seen that used quite a bit. I always think when there's an option like, oh, go here or go there, it breaks the immersion, and that's what I never want to do. But I think it will be developing like that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.